So I'll be talking about tensor methods. I'm sure all of you here are aware of matrix factorization techniques, right? They're very easy to run. They're highly parallelizable. They can be done on data across various different domains. So why go to tensors, right? What additional capabilities can we get by thinking about tensor factorization when compared to matrix factorization techniques? And as Ben mentioned, if you want to learn like complicated probabilistic models, how do tensors figure in? Like why matrices are not enough and why tensors can give a lot, much more powerful set of techniques. So that's what I'll be talking about today. So indeed, all of you here are aware of data deluge in a number of domains. We have like tons of data in social networks, images, genomic data. Everywhere the data is just growing at a very fast pace, right? At a pace that we are not able to keep up with. But this is all not good news. While there is a lot of data, how much of it is good information? As Kevin here is saying, he likes to mess with data. So there's a lot of data that's like highly messy. It could be adversarially corrupted, or it could have a lot of outliers, missing observations. So just the fact that there is a lot of data is not good news, right? Because of all these highly corrupt and messy data, we cannot immediately get the kind of information we want. So this is what we call the high dimensional regime. As we have more data, we also have more variables or unknowns. So in this regime, how do we come up with scalable techniques, right? How do we come up with techniques that can still mine useful information from this large scale data? So that's why I'd like to think of this data deluge also as an information desert, because it makes finding useful information even harder as we have more data. And so, you can also treat this as a ill-posed problem, right? Because you have now this very huge number of unknown variables that you'd like to fit with the given data, but there are more variables than data. So how do you do this in an efficient way? And this is where you'd like to think of modeling such useful information. So we'd like to think of this useful information as some low-dimensional structures in this high-dimensional, large-scale data. So finding such useful information then is literally finding a needle in a haystack. So this is what makes the big data problem a computationally challenging one, because the useful information is literally hidden in this hay of very large-scale data, right? So how do we come up with approaches that can find this useful information in this large-scale data? So if you want to go about this in a principled way, we can think of modeling the data. Can we explain, okay, this is probably how the data got generated? Can we posit different kinds of factors that generated the data in the current form? And to do that, a very important component is having latent variables, right? Indeed, you cannot observe everything that would have led to this data generation. So the question is, what kinds of hidden effects are responsible for having useful information content in this big data that we have? And the question is, can we mine such useful relationships, right, between the hidden and observed variables? So how can we do this efficiently? So this is how we can incorporate at least the aspect of different kinds of domain knowledge and prior information in the form of these latent variable models. So some very simple ways to have these hidden effects is through mixture models, right? You can posit that there isn't one kind of data. The data belongs to groups or different kinds of clusters, right? Can we find these clusters once we have the data, right? So this is all the classical clustering approaches given the data, right? But the more advanced form is to have very rich class of probabilistic models. There can be huge set of hidden and observed variables and complicated relationships that relate them. It could be hierarchy of hidden variables. There could be kind of complicated connections between hidden and observed variables. So you can have all these probabilistic models for positing how the data is generated, right? What kind of hidden effects lead to the generation of data? And so this is nice. So we have a principled approach to kind of come up with rich class of models for data. But the next question is, how do we fit these models? How do we efficiently learn the parameters of such models once we posit them, right? So this is what my talk will be focused on how to come up with good computational techniques for such complicated probabilistic models, right? And indeed, if you think of applications of such latent variable models, they are just ubiquitous. Like, as Ben pointed out, one of the applications I'll be focusing on will be this topic modeling. So if you want to model a large corpus of documents, I'd like to, look at kind of, documents that are similar to one another, right? So I'd like to be able to summarize useful documents. I'd like to mine for what are the hidden topics in different documents. Like, what are these documents talking about? So just by looking at, the content or the words in the document, can I mine for these hidden topics, right? And in social networks, popular application is to learn about the nodes in the network, right? So many times, so you only have limited information such as social ties or interactions. For instance, say friendship relations on Facebook. But you'd like to, learn like more informative structures on these nodes, like what kind of communities do they belong to, what kind of interests or hobbies different people may have. Can I learn this automatically given large amounts of social network data, right, or any kind of graph-based data? And indeed, another very important application for such latent variable modeling is recommender systems. So you can think of setting where you can have a probabilistic model of, okay, there are different groups of users with different kinds of interests and attributes. Can I find these groups of both users and products in an efficient way and then use them to come up with better recommendations? So this will not only give better recommendations, but also help us explore what are the different kinds of users, right, that are liking these different products. What kind of factors are driving them to like different kind of products. So this will also be a more explanatory analysis of the data at hand. So indeed, in all these different settings, it's very cheap to get unlabeled samples. We have tons of unlabeled samples, but it's much more expensive, or sometimes due to privacy concerns, may not be possible to get labeled samples. Right? So that's why, that's the other challenge of learning these models, that this is unsupervised. We don't have labeled samples, or we may have very few labeled samples in these domains. So how can we still learn this useful information or these hidden variables from the observed data, right, without any supervision? So even when the task is actually a supervised learning task, these unsupervised learning methods can be very useful. Indeed, like one of the exciting areas of machine learning has been this feature engineering, right? How do we engineer automatically good feature transformations for classification tasks? Like, can we automatically learn good representations of the data, right? Indeed, in computer vision, in natural language processing, this is revolutionizing the classification performance. And just as toy example I've shown here, if you learn like the basis or the representation of these complicated shapes here, right? So you can see that they're made up of just a very few simple elementary shapes that make lead to these much more complicated observations. If we learn that basis, then we can come up with a good way to explain how these different observed structures are generated. So, technically, this model is also known as the dictionary learning model, because you're also learning the dictionary or the representation of the data in an unsupervised way. So in all these different applications, there is unsupervised learning, and we'd like to have like rich probabilistic models with hidden variables to explain this unlabeled data. And this, we'd like to do it at a large scale. So how can we fit the parameters of this rich class of models in an efficient way? Right? So in general, if you look at likelihood-based approaches, right? So you want to maximize the likelihood of these models. That's a highly non-convex problem, right? It'll have tons of local optima, especially as you increase the dimensions, as you make the problem have more parameters, there'll be many more local optima, right? So it'll have pure, the convergence will be pretty poor in high dimensions. So, maximum likelihood, in fact, theoretically is also NP-hard for many of these problems, right? And in practice, if you do any kind of local search, like expectation maximization, variational Bayes is a popular approach for many of these models, which look at relaxations of the likelihood function, but all of these suffer from the same problem that they can get stuck in these local optima, right? There are tons of very, bad local optima, and if you're just trying to move locally, there is no consistency guarantees, right? So you have no guarantee that you will go to the global optimum. There's no guarantee that you will actually learn the parameters of an optimal model, to fit this data, right? So, and the other, bad thing about these likelihood methods is they're very hard to parallelize. Right? It's not a trivial thing to, just take, look at this likelihood function and say, okay, I'm going to divide this across many machines. Right? So these likelihood-based techniques have all these disadvantages when it comes to, doing it on a large scale. So the question I'd like to ask is, are there any, powerful alternatives, right? Both in theory and in practice, can we think about alternate techniques to fit these models? I'm not going to aim for maximizing the likelihood, but maybe there are other kind of constraints in the model that I can incorporate that can be solved more efficiently, and at the same time, be easier to parallelize and do this on a large scale. And indeed, there exists such class of techniques. So first, I'll show the classical spectral technique, right? I'm sure all of you here are aware of PCA, right? So you look at the data, you want to find a low-dimensional projection of the data, right? And it can be done efficiently through eigendecomposition of the covariance matrix of the data, right? So this is very easy to run. This, matrix methods can be easily parallelized, scalable. But the question is, can we look beyond this? Suppose I don't want to look just at pairwise relationships between data. So I don't want to just look at the covariance matrix. I'd like to look at higher order relationships in data. Can we look at higher order moments in the data and ask, can we look at finding low dimensional projections of these higher order moments? So that's what I mean by spectral techniques on tensors. So we'll be encoding tensors that will look at higher order relationships in the data and then come up with efficient methods to do low rank approximations of these tensors. And then we'll see that theoretically, in fact, this is well grounded. You can, in fact, correctly learn the parameters of many of the models that I showed. Right? If you just use the covariance matrix, you cannot learn a model. Right? I mean, you can do PCA, but it's not a model-based framework. But now with tensors, in fact, we show that you can correctly fit the parameters of many interesting class of latent variable models. And just to kind of think about tensors, if you think of the matrix, right, for pairwise relationships, you can use a matrix to represent them. And similarly, with the third order tensor, you can now represent triplets of relationships. So here I'm looking at the cross correlation between any 3 dimensions of my data. Right? So I can now similarly keep representing these higher order relationships using tensors. And once I have this representation, I'd like to now come up with an analog of matrix spectral decomposition. Right? So for a matrix, the idea is if I want to find an eigendecomposition, I want to find the most compact way to represent the matrix in terms of its rank 1 components. Right? So and we know that this can be done efficiently. So the analog for tensors is exactly the same idea that I have a tensor. I'd like to represent it as sum of rank 1 components. Right? I'd like to find the most compact such representation of my tensor. Right? And indeed, this is also a non-convex problem. Right? Even the matrix eigendecomposition is a non-convex problem. And similarly, the tensor one is also a non-convex problem. So it will have multiple local optima, but the question is, can we still give a guarantee, right? In the matrix case, we still know that we can get the correct decomposition. We can get the globally optimal solution. The question is how much of those properties to carry over to tensors. So can we efficiently carry out these spectral decomposition of tensors, and what are the algorithms to do that? And one nice property is, if you have an orthogonal tensor, so meaning there is a tensor that can be represented as sum of rank 1 terms that are orthogonal to one another, what we can show is a variant of the matrix method will give the correct solution. So if you recall, with matrices, you can do the power method, right? So essentially, the idea is you take a matrix, you multiply it with a vector, normalize it, and keep repeating this again and again, right? So this is the popular matrix power method, and I've written it in this notation to mean that I'm essentially manipulating the matrix along the second mode or the second dimension here, right? And with tensor, you can come up with a variant of the power method where you'll be contracting the tensor along multiple modes. So here I'm like contracting the tensor along the second and the third mode, so that's why the output is a vector. So in the matrix case, when I contracted the matrix along the second mode, I got a vector. But because the tensor is a 3-dimensional object, if I contract it along 2 of the modes, I get back a vector. So intuitively, this is a variation of this matrix power method, but the idea is as you run this for many iterations, you will converge to one of these eigenvectors of this orthogonal tensor, right? So one of the main properties we've shown is that even though this is a non-convex problem, there are no spurious solutions. So this is the nice structure of tensor algebra here that's coming into play that shows that the only robust points or the only points that this tensor method will converge to are the components of this decomposition. And all other eigenvectors are just saddle points. So meaning you won't encounter them with probability 1. Right? So the idea is what the theory is saying is that even though this is a non-convex problem, for such class of tensors, I can correctly solve this decomposition. So I can get the correct solution, right? So this is what differentiates it from all other kinds of non-convex problems, right? There is the expectation maximization for various different models. There's backpropagation in neural networks. They're all highly non-convex, and we have no guarantees where we may converge. But what the departure for the tensor method is we can exactly guarantee where we will converge. So that's the beauty of the tensor algebra that makes it possible to have a theoretical guarantee, right? So the nice thing is, this is not true not just for orthogonal tensors, but even tensors that are not orthogonal. So I'll show in a few minutes later, if you think of topic models and generate these tensors using word co-occurrence counts, right? These components will not be orthogonal in general. And but what we can show is with tensors, even non-orthogonal components, you can correctly identify and learn them. So you can do that through this. I won't go into the detail. There is a whitening transformation, but the idea is, put together, there is a guaranteed method to get the correct decomposition of the tensor, right? And now the question is, how do we find for various latent variable models, what are these tensors, right? How do we construct these tensors and how do we manipulate them? So that's what we'll see for various different models, what these tensors mean. So if you look at topic modeling application, the idea is, you want to model the words in a document in a bag of words manner, right? Meaning you don't care about the order of the words. You think of every word as generated from this set of topics. So here, every document has, say, some proportion of topics here. For instance, this document has like 60% sports, 30% science, and so on, right? So once you have this mixture of topics within a document, for each word, you have this conditional probability of drawing that word, right? So first you draw this topic with 60% chance you're going to draw sports, And once you draw sports, you're going to draw individual words with some unknown probabilities. Right? So this is the admixture topic model. Right? So the unknown parameters here are, what are these conditional probabilities, right? How are different words generated under different topics? Can I learn these probabilities? And also, can I infer what are the proportions of different topics in my document? Can I do this efficiently? So what we'll see is, first, if I just think of the case when there's only one topic in each document, right? Just for simplicity, let's look at that setting. What we can show is, just using some of the simple conditional independence constraints that's posited by the model, that if you look at like pairwise and triplet co-occurrence relationships, meaning I'm looking at the probability of joint occurrence of various words in the document. Right? So pairwise means I look at every pair of words and ask how many times did they occur over all these set of documents. And similarly, if it's a triplet, I do it over every triplet of words. And that's how I get my tensor. Right? So we'll get this tensor by looking at co-occurrence counts in the documents. And once we have that, what we are saying is that the decomposition of this tensor, so if you find the components of this tensor, you can get back the parameters of the model. So here each component corresponds to the conditional probability of words given that particular topic. So you can correctly find the parameters of this model by looking at tensor decomposition algorithm. And the idea is, in fact, you can extend this to much richer models. The popular one is the latent Dirichlet allocation, right? There are like multiple topics in each document distributed according to a Dirichlet distribution. And then, you want to learn such a model. And we show that, in fact, we can even learn such class of models using these tensor methods. And it's not only those models, but a whole other family of models. These include the classical Gaussian mixtures, the hidden Markov models for sequence data. The independent component analysis looks at when there are like many sources that are getting mixed, right? Can we unmix them and get back the individual sources? This is in blind source separation is the other term for ICA. Right? And there could be all kinds of multi-view data, right? You have rich sources of information in terms of audio, video, and text, but there is this common hidden set of factors that generate them. Can we learn such models? And in fact, there's been a lot of exciting work in extending this tensor framework to mixtures of ranking models, to mixtures of tree probabilistic models. So there's a whole family of probabilistic models where we can look at the higher order moments of the data and then fit them to the parameters of these models in an efficient way. And so that's the overall framework, right? So when we have unlabeled data in various different domains, there could be social network data, it could be text data, there could be image data. And once we have like this class of latent variable models, we construct tensors from higher order moments of data, and using the decomposition, we can do inferences on the model. So in this example, I've shown that you can infer the different topics in a document, and similarly in the community setting, you can infer what are the different community memberships of nodes in a network. Right? So if you're only given graph data of which nodes are friends with each other, can we learn the community memberships in an efficient way? And so this is all nice in theory. We have a consistent way to learn the parameters of a rich class of models, but how do they work in practice, and what kind of comparisons can we do with other existing techniques? Right, so I'll just show like just one experiment just to drive home the point. I mean, we have a whole list of them on my website. But the idea is, for instance, if you look at the DBLP data set that looks at who co-authored with whom, right? It's the co-authorship network. And we'd like to infer the communities of these authors. Just by looking at the co-authorship data, can we look at what are the hidden communities? So, we compared it with variational technique. Right, so this is from Dave Bly's group. I mean, they use the very optimized stochastic variational approaches for learning the models, and we see like a huge improvement in running time, like more than 50 times improvement in running time using our tensor method. And this is just on a single workstation. We can handle like 1 million nodes and efficiently process multiple community memberships for the nodes in the network. And so this is very nicely scalable even on single workstations. And just to give some qualitative interpretations of what this model learns, when we had this on ELP data set, so we only looked at the graph relationships. We only looked at which users rated which businesses, right? We even didn't look at the text. So this is the minimum amount of information possible. We only looked at who reviewed what, right? So using just that information and feeding it to our tensor method, we could learn like what are the unknown categories of businesses, right? So this is, we didn't use the business categories during the learning phase. So this is just for validation. And here you see that as expected, it's a restaurant business is the top category. Like, it's learned very with minimum error. But there are also interesting communities that are learned with good accuracy. For instance, hobby shops or mass media, there aren't that many users going on ELP and reviewing them, right? Meaning these communities are small communities. And yet, like our tensor method is looking at relationships between users. It's looking at what are the common set of users who are going and reviewing these businesses, and it's trying to find a good representation of such tensors. And that's why it's able to learn not just the large communities in this ELP network, but also these smaller communities. And the other strength of this method is to be able to learn multiple communities or attributes for every node. For instance, here you see like a business, you can classify them into multiple categories, right? It's a restaurant, it's a bar, it has a specific location, it has a specific kind of food. So, by having these mixed membership probabilistic models, we can now learn these multiple memberships for every node. So this is in departure from, like clustering-based methods, which will only group the node into one category. So you can learn multiple categories for every node using these probabilistic models. And the other nice thing about these tensor methods is they're naturally scalable, right? So all these operations consist of simple linear algebraic and multilinear algebraic operations. So they can be easily parallelized on GPUs, and you can get very good scalability. Here we see like the best scalability is when you run this on CUDA, which is based on CUDA, and it's a linear algebra library for GPUs. And if you do device level interface, meaning we optimize for communication between GPU and CPU, we can get very impressive gains in terms of being able to learn a large scale model with such tensor methods. And the other thing is to go to the cloud, right? So if I have a very large amounts of data, I'd like to parallelize it across multiple machines. And these tensor methods are also very suited for that, but not on the just basic MapReduce framework. If you just do the basic one, there is just too much of like overhead because of a lot of disk reading and allocation in every iteration. Right? So because these tensor methods are iterative, if in every iteration I have to do these operations, this is very expensive. And so what we instead did was we looked at this Apache Reef, which is an open source software, and this is in collaboration with researchers at Microsoft Research. And the advantage of such a framework is there's only one time allocation. So for iterative methods, now we can run them very efficiently on such a cloud-based framework. And this is still work in progress, but some preliminary results that we got, using just like, we just looked at like 4 machines versus 1 machine. We see that there is a very big improvement in time, especially if you compare to the basic MapReduce. It's just too expensive for communication, right? In fact, the likelihood-based method will do better than if you just did a basic MapReduce framework. But with Reef, the time taken goes down drastically as you keep adding more and more machines. And we also see that we get better perplexity, or this is the exponential of the negative likelihood, right? So meaning a lower score is better. So we even get a better perplexity score compared to the variational techniques. So we are getting wins in both ways, right? We are drastically reduce the computational time, and we are also getting very good perplexity from these experiments. So to conclude, these tensor methods, in theory, we can guarantee that they will get you the correct set of parameters of these various underlying probabilistic models, and they're much faster and easily parallelizable compared to traditional variational or likelihood-based techniques. And some of the ongoing work is to even extend this tensor framework from generative setting to discriminative setting. So we have now some alternative techniques to even train neural networks, multi-layer neural networks using these tensor decomposition techniques. This can be powerful alternatives to the traditional backpropagation kind of methods. And the nice thing is we also can theoretically analyze these methods and say when we can get the correct solutions using these methods. So this is my fantastic group of students who've been instrumental in various different pieces of the work that I've shown here, and also an extended set of talks and videos are available from my summer school sessions in CMU this summer. So you can also take a look at them on the website. Thank you.